There lies a tower in the mountains where he practices. We saw him once, on our expedition to count and collect the soldiers that had fallen in the battle against the West. Notably, there were fewer soldiers than we had expected. He was quiet, but welcoming, and offered a warm fire and hot food. No one mentioned the armor and weapons from both sides he had stacked neatly in the corner, or the odd odor that would waft from the cellar from time to time. As we sat and exchanged pleasantries, we knew, and he knew we knew. As we thanked him and left, he gave us account of those that had fallen. I knew not to inquire further. Never ask a necromancer for your stuff back if you want it in the same condition. Necromancy in D&D is strange. It's the school of magic that deals with the manipulation of life and death according to the 3.5 PHB, but more recently I think it's been associated with hexes and curses and things of that nature as well. The trope of trying to summon legions of skeletons and zombies is nothing new to fantasy, but it's something that's really not supported by the 5e system itself. And this is for a few reasons. One is because the more action economy you provide to players, the stronger they become, and much stronger. And so by summoning legions of creatures, you've added quite a bit to the action economy. But also because necromancy is seen as inherently evil to D&D systems, 5e included. And there aren't many evil options provided to players, and so I think that's a reason why there aren't many necromancy things provided to any of the player base. In this video, I'd like to analyze necromancy and hopefully provide a resource that's useful to DMs from a world building perspective, but also to players that really want to play a satisfying necromancer. But first, we're going to have to make some changes to necromancy as they stand right now. In both the early days of D&D and in other fantasy genres, necromancy is evil. It produces evil creatures that are raised from the dead from a crazy wizard or sorcerer that wishes to unleash evil upon the world with its undeath, right? But I think as stories have developed and we've created a more complex system of storytelling, it's due for an update. And I also think that the D&D developers realize that, because they've been slowly making changes over the years, but are probably still stuck in their old ways because they're using old systems and just updating them to new versions. Yes, the 5th edition is a new edition, but it borrows greatly from 4e and 3.5 and 2 and 1, so there's still some remnants of things left over. That's why I personally think spells like Healing Word and Cure Wounds are evocation in the 5th edition, even though they're very obviously dealing with life force, and that's something that necromancy deals with. In 3.5, they were conjuration spells because healing was conjured. I think it's a way just to avoid creating necromancy spells that are associated with positive things like healing and, curing ailments and things of that nature, right? We're almost there with those changes with spells like Revivify, which are critical 3rd level spells for a lot of clerics and paladins to pick up. So if you're in a world that hates necromancy, you're going to have to deal with the fact that clerics that players might be playing are grabbing Revivify and using that as a way to revive downed players, right? And I think that means that it's time for a change for necromancy in both world building and then, because of that, mechanically. We can do that first by analyzing the schools of magic themselves and realize that I don't think there's inherent evil in any school of magic. If anything, there's an argument for schools of magic like enchantment or evocation to be more inherently evil than necromancy. I mean, manipulating someone's mind or blowing things up seems a lot more evil than, raising a few dead things. So let's make a few changes now. I promise they won't be too bad, and I think the first one should just be eliminating the preconception that necromancy is inherently evil, and that's something that's written into the rules. I'll read it right now. The 5e basic rules state, creating the undead through the use of necromancy spells, such as Animate Dead, is not a good act, and only evil casters use such spells frequently. Throw that out. That's ridiculous binary garbage that's being used in the rules to prescribe an identity to characters that use Animate Dead or other necromantic spells. Get rid of it. Next, with that groundwork laid, I think we can start changing some of the spells. I mentioned before Healing Word and Cure Wounds, but also Mass Cure Wounds, Mass Healing Word, Heal, Prayer of Healing. I think all of those could be great candidates to switch from Evocation to Necromancy. I think other healing spells can stay where they are. Spells like Lesser Restoration make sense for Abjuration because it can kind of be like a ward. Healing Spirit is obviously conjuring a healing spirit, so I think that stays in Conjuration. But I'd also like to switch another spell, which is Hex. Now, Hex isn't something that's picked up by wizards and clerics and all that. It's usually a warlock spell, but I think it's also thematic for Necromancy, because Necromancy seems in this edition to deal with curses also. Bestow Curse is a Necromancy spell, as is Blindness, Deafness. And so I think Hex should definitely switch over to Necromancy too. Although I could see the case for things like Hexes to be in the Enchantment school. So if you want to move all of the Hexes and Curses over to Enchantment, I think that makes sense too. I think for me personally, binding certain curses to your soul, which feels very necromantic, is something that I enjoy, the thematic thought of, so I think I'm going to switch all of those over to Necromancy. And that's really it. I wouldn't be making these suggestions if I didn't think that these were going to be blanket improvements. I think removing the inherent evil to Necromancy is something that opens the world up to much more complex storytelling, and switching some of those spells over to Necromancy then adds verisimilitude to the world, so players can feel more immersed. But there are still some problems. The Necromancer outlined in Volo's Guide to Monsters is a 12th level wizard with a d8 hit die instead of a d6. Thanks, Volo. So we need to identify some goals for our Necromancer, regardless if they're a player character, an NPC, or an enemy. And these should be relatively simple to identify, but possibly hard to execute. I think the first goal would be raising the dead, right? That one seems pretty obvious. The second goal might be curses or dark rituals. And the third is manipulating life force in general. I think a good thing to do first is to look at player classes and subclasses and build from there. I say this because NPCs and villains that are built off of player classes, I find at least, are very memorable because they have really cool abilities to work with. But unfortunately, as I mentioned prior, Necromancers don't really come online as players until a lot later because of how powerful it is to summon creatures. So a lot of our NPCs and villains will have to be late level Necromancers, and even our player builds are probably going to feel a little slow and clunky as Necromancers early on, but it might be improved later. First is the School of Necromancy Wizard, and this build is exactly what it sounds like. You play a wizard, and then your subclass is the School of Necromancy. I would fill your spellbook with as many Necromancy spells as you possibly can, because there aren't many available to you, especially early on. The thing is that this is a very thematic subclass, I find, because wizards have to train and improve using their spellbook, and they have to learn, right? So early on, it might not feel like you're a necromancer, but the ability to raise dead comes later as you learn and study more. I think the second level ability, Grim Harvest, plays really well into this because it mentions manipulating life force a tiny bit to regain some vitality. But again, as you grow and learn, that manipulation can turn into full-on control, and then you can start providing life to bodies, right? And they raise from the dead. So again, I find it a really nice thematic progression for the School of Necromancy. I'd say the build really comes online when you hit 5th level and you get access to 3rd level spells, so that means you have Animate Dead. And even if you don't grab Animate Dead at 5th level for some reason, 6th level, the ability Undead Thralls gives that to you and it improves it greatly. Now, at 9th level, that's another progression that you're going to want to look out for because that allows you to raise dead. And then again, at 11th level, that gives you Create Dead. So there's a lot of options if you want to raise things from the dead. I think also, if you like the curse motif, you have access to Blindness, Deafness, and also Bestow Curse. But what if Wizard really isn't your style? Well, the Cleric offers 2 subclasses, the Death Domain Cleric and the Grave Domain Cleric, that I think really fit Necromancy thematically. There's distinct differences between the two. The Death Domain Cleric seems like it lends itself more towards a curse build. You can curse people with blindness, you can sap their strength, there's an ability that lets you add necrotic damage to your attacks, so it's kind of like cursing your own attacks. I think that works really great for a curse build. The Grave Domain Cleric gets access to Spare the Dying, they get Revivify, they can cancel lethal damage, so they're more about manipulating life force than curses or raising dead, especially because the Grave Domain doesn't get access to Animate Dead on its expanded spell list, which is interesting, because that means that we have a triangle. The Grave Domain Cleric is about manipulating life forces, the Death Domain Cleric is about curses, and the School of Necromancy is about raising the dead. Now, I think this is a great triangle because if you don't agree with me exactly on my perceptions about necromancy, you can see where you lie on this triangle and build your own necromancer based on that. Now, using this, we can fit an NPC or an enemy onto this triangle, but I think there's another player subclass that I really want to mention that lends itself really well towards necromancy, and not many people talk about it. I think the Circle of Spores Druid is a fantastic necromancy build. They get access to Blindness Deafness for a curse, they can learn Gentle Repose for that manipulation of life force, and then a little later, they can learn Animate Dead. And there's also an ability that they have at 6th level called Fungal Infestation, where they can infect or infest a corpse with all of their spores, and it raises up from the dead, which is really, really cool for kind of this creepy, naturalistic necromancy vibe. I definitely recommend if you're looking for that kind of style of necromancy. Now, there are still things we can do as DMs or ask as players to enhance our necromancers and make them feel a little bit stronger. There's a concept that I made up called character boons. I made a video about it a while back, but I can briefly explain it here. Basically, you take a magic item that's already existing or a magic item that you made up, and instead of it being an item, it's an ability that you can give to a player character or an enemy or an NPC, and it makes them feel like they're gaining some kind of ability because of their skill or their learning, over the course of their progression. I find that giving magic items sometimes is a little less rewarding than saying, oh yeah, you've become so much stronger over the course of your adventure. So I think that's something we could definitely do with necromancy. Something like a ring of spell storing that provides someone Animate Dead or Raise Dead, but instead of it being a ring, you just explain it away as someone is really, really good at necromancy. That could be a really great reward for a player. It makes them feel like they're learning and gaining some skill. That would just be, again, like the ring of spell storing. You get to use the spell without expending a spell slot, and you get to use it once per day, or it recharges at dawn or something like that. I would be wary of providing resistance to necrotic damage or providing the ability to ignore resistance to necrotic damage in enemies, because it steps on the toes of the wizard's Inured to Death ability, or the Inescapable Destruction ability from the Death Domain Cleric, respectively. So again, be careful of stepping on toes. I also really like the idea of giving curses to players that they can use once per day. Dragon Magazine number 229 has a really great list of curses. It's super old, and so it's not up to date, but I wrote some down here that I updated to the 5th edition. I have Chills, which is a creature within 60 feet becomes cold and uncomfortable as if it has a fever. The creature cannot take reactions and has disadvantage on saves against the cold. Insomnia, a creature within 60 feet is cursed with an insomnia. Creatures with insomnia cannot benefit from a short or long rest. Curses like this, again, might be better for like a witch, but there's no witch class, which I think they should add with like a warlord or something like that. But whatever, that's a discussion for another time. Another really cool thing that you could do to add some spice to your necromancers is to provide some kind of special type of undead. So like an Eladrin necromancer that has obvious connections to the Feywild might raise things like red caps or blink dogs or gremlins to, sell that they're from the Feywild. There's of course the lichdom trope. Becoming a lich is a very long process that isn't within the 5th edition. I don't think it's ever really been detailed in any edition, but there's a really great video by Jorfden. I'll definitely link it down below, but it has some great insight on how a player character might want to become a lich. It's a very well-produced video, so again, I'll link it down below. So great, now we have a bunch of abilities from subclasses and cool character enhancements that we can give to NPCs and enemies to make them feel like really great necromancers. I would take something like Halo of Spores, give it to a necromancer enemy. It allows them to do AoE damage to a party, gives them a much stronger presence in the action economy. Something like Reaper from the Death Domain Cleric also does that kind of action economy thing. Providing Undead Thralls, the ability from the Necromancy Wizard, is just always an improvement for an enemy or an NPC. I think adding a character enhancement could be a really great idea. Maybe a Necromancer that only summons skeletons, or a Necromancer that transfers their soul to the thing that they're raising to become that creature, and their body that they left behind is the undead husk. There's a lot of possibilities with stories and things like that that can make really memorable villains. We now have all the tools and components to build a Necromancer, and I think the only thing left to talk about is world building and societal expectations. I think, again, as I mentioned before, completely destigmatizing necromancy and putting it on the same level as every other type of magic is a really great thing. If we make the switch over from the healing spells and how they are with evocation over to necromancy, that could make something like a cleric of life or a life domain cleric a necromancer. And are those people inherently evil? I don't think so. I think the Necromancer mentioned in the opening monologue, I don't think he was evil. He seemed like a nice guy. Maybe he's a little morally neutral for, keeping fallen soldiers. But I think, again, this kind of discussion allows for a more complex and rich world where there aren't like binary evils and goods. It reminds me a lot of the alignment discussion. I've kind of done away with alignment, and if you want a character alignment, I don't want you to fall back on it as a description for why your character is doing something. It feels a little silly, but it feels the same. Necromancy is a tool for you to use, and your personality is going to determine how you're using the tool. So if you're a good person, you might use necromancy for good, and if you're a bad person or evil, you might use necromancy for evil, just like you would use a hammer or evocation magic or a sword or whatever else. It's a tool, and you are the person that's dictating how that tool is being used. With that, for world building, I think there are a lot of interesting discussions that a kingdom could have. Maybe there's an ethical discussion about raising soldiers from the dead to use them again in a battle. Is that ethical? Is it ethical to extend the life of a king or a queen to extend their reign? If there's healers around, is it ethical to not have people heal people in small villages or things like that if it's available, if it's free and something that they could do to help their citizens? Where do wizards practice curses? Do they practice them on other people? Maybe they practice them on prisoners or enemies of war. It's a really, really interesting discussion that now you can have now that necromancy is opened up and isn't just always seen as evil. I have a quick message before the end of the video. First of all, thank you for watching. And to the 4 people that watch this, you may have noticed that the content style has changed a little bit. There was a big break. There was a lot of stuff that was going on, but basically the channel has kind of changed a little bit. The Patreon right now is not going to have bi-weekly homebrew packs like we've been saying at the end of the video in the past. I think the change really has to do with content quality. I want to always be able to provide quality content, and I think I can do that through videos. I'm not sure that I can always do that through content packs that are going to be bi-weekly. So right now, the Patreon is still active. It's still up. It's going to be used more of like an archive or storage for video ideas, like PDFs that are released. That video about the Remoraz that I made, the free PDF is still up there, and the homebrew packs are still there. I think you can get them if you pledge, but no pressure at all whatsoever. Again, I really want to thank you for watching this video. If you liked the content, I'd really appreciate the subscription. You'll get notified, I think, whenever I make a new video. I'd love to hear some of your comments down below on how you think necromancy should interact with the world. So yeah, thank you very much.